Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I just appreciate you watching. Today we are talking about accessibility from the perspective of accessibility in this course. We do talk about it from a bit of a different perspective than how we talk about it in different courses, right? We don't talk about it as much from a technical perspective in this course. We talk more about it from a bit of a holistic, a bit of a user experience perspective, because we do consider this as being, the idea of access being designing for everybody, right? When we talk about the designer's code of ethics a little bit later on in the course, one of the things that we talk about is the idea that there is no edge cases. Right, we think about the idea of an edge case as something that's on the fringe, right? And we'll talk more about this as we get in depth with kind of talking about accessibility today. But as we approach the idea of something being for everybody, a website being for everybody, access and inclusion includes all people, which means that people that access information on the web differently need to be able to access all information regardless of which site it is presented on. So we reiterate the point or the purpose and the importance of accessibility kind of as we go forward here. And we really examine accessibility from a design perspective, because I do think it is incredibly important. And that's why we discuss these concepts in several classes. But from our perspective here, I'd like to open it up with Tim Berners-Lee in terms of what is accessibility. And we kind of look at accessibility from a few different perspectives here. We kind of look at it from a moralistic standpoint, even a religious standpoint here, which was interesting. I actually had a student who was a devout Catholic a few years ago who kind of brought this perspective into play here. And then from a legalistic standpoint as well, the idea of the fact that, there are laws in place that govern accessibility. But Tim Berners-Lee, who we see pictured here, basically one of the fathers of the modern internet. We talk about the history of the internet. World Wide Web project, that came out of CERN. Tim Berners-Lee sort of headed up that. We saw, things like the World Wide Web, the URL, different things of that nature come out of this project that was headed by Tim Berners-Lee. And the influence of Tim Berners-Lee is still around today in things like the W3C. Right, the World Wide Web Consortium, the standards body that helps oversee, the standards for HTML and CSS. And Tim Berners-Lee has said that the power of the web is in its universality, and I think that statement in and of itself has a lot of power to it. Right, the power of the web is in its universality. For something to be universal, meaning it's for everybody, meaning that it is for all people, it is, it's universal. It's universally available. When we think about the internet, we think about, especially in the early days of the internet, right? Our modern perspectives of the internet have kind of changed, I think, a bit when it comes to kind of what the internet does and what the internet means. right? Who kind of controls the internet? Because especially in the early days of the internet, there was this sort of idea that, well, if you wanted to do it, you could do it and you could make it and you could put it out there and it would be available for everybody and everybody could see it and everybody could use it. And it would be a thing that would be important for the world, or could be important for the world, I guess would be a better way to put that. Because it would be some information that maybe at one time wouldn't leave a small area. But now it's available to people around the globe. And that was a huge deal. And then over time, right, we've seen this sort of change. And with this sort of change that we've kind of seen, where kind of the internet's become controlled by this like select few companies, right? We see Amazon, Google, Facebook sort of take over the idea of a smaller voice gaining traction on the internet has diminished, but it still has this universal aspect, right? Like I can still create a website. I can still create a web application. I can still put it online, and I can still create something that is unique, that can get my voice out there, that can make my voice heard. And insofar as all that goes, when it comes to the concept of universality, Tim Berners-Lee went on to say that access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect, right? Because when we think about information is for all people, right? Information is for you, information is for me, information is for everyone, right? And so when we think about the World Wide Web, the information superhighway, as it was once termed, right? The big classic idea of why the internet was at once created, this information superhighway. We're able to interconnect computers and connect people to websites and share information globally. So if information can be for all people and education can be for all people, then a physical disability should not be an impetus for me to have restricted access to information and education. Right? So we have this sort of moral obligation as individuals who are building the internet and sharing information across the world, that if we are going to share information to people that need information, that we need to be able to make sure that the information that we are sharing is accessible to the largest amount of people possible, which includes individuals with disabilities. We can even add the Ignatian concept of inclusion to the concept of accessibility here, supporting underserved populations. Ignatian, if you particularly, I believe, Catholicism, and specific maybe sects of Catholicism there have this sort of understanding of Ignatian principles, the idea of inclusion, right, and being inclusive and supporting the underserved, or the for lack of a better word, I guess, needy, in air quotes, right? If we want to think about it in maybe ways that we've traditionally thought about, like maybe religious needs in that sort of way, right? Like if we think about the way that, maybe support has been given to underserved populations in general, we oftentimes think about financial support, I guess is a better way to probably put that. But there are other ways to support underserved populations that are not financial. Right? Because one of the things that we talk about, like we talked about previously in design, we talk about the idea of, this sort of universality of design, right? To where, the more specific we make something, the more specific that we kind of get with our representation, the lesser it is in terms of how it relates to our user base. And so it might turn off or discourage certain users from using our site because they can't relate to the representation that is being shown on the site, right? One of the things that we, hear about oftentimes, like there's a study done several years ago where people were shown faces. They were shown faces in varying levels of detail, and they were asked which ones that they related the most with, right? And most people typically identified two faces in particular that they identified the most with out of all the faces that were shown. One was the face that had the most discernible features that looked like themselves, right? That they could kind of see themselves in. Right, when you think about people of different ethnicities and different backgrounds and things of that nature, though, when you kind of spread those out, you have smaller groups of people that relate to each of those individual faces. However, almost universally, the simple, smiley face, just circle, 2-dot, semicircle mouth, was recognizable, relatable to everybody who participated in the study. Right, so we kind of see this kind of opening up for access here. And so individuals with disabilities, they are another underserved population, right? And so, in the Web 115 course, when we first start talking about the concept of accessibility, we start talking about it from the perspective of assistive technologies. And I ask, the room who uses assistive technology. And I try to, get some, see who raises their hands. And tell people to raise their hands when I don't see people wearing glasses, raise their hands, because the glasses are a form of assistive technology, right? We have these assistive technologies that serve these underserved populations that allow these individuals to, experience the internet in forms that, maybe they had not once been allowed to utilize. Right, so we are not only being able to support the universality of the distribution of information to all people, but we are also being inclusive of underserved populations and ensuring that all people have access to our websites and all people have access to our information equitably. And there are laws in place. And I have the federal Section 508 standards here. And those federal Section 508 standards do only apply to certain organizations, right? Essentially, if you are a federal government organization or you receive federal government funding, then you are bound to meet Section 508 standards of the American Disabilities Act law. for web accessibility. And actually, if you look at those, they're really kind of vague and seemingly incredibly easy to meet these standards. That's why, in general, we've adopted the WCAG standards. WCAG 2.0, WCAG 3.0 coming out. I think they're in the review process of 3.0 now. 3.0 I expect to be adopted and in use very soon. And so we have all these different perspectives as to what accessibility is, but what we don't really talk about that much is what accessibility is not. And I think the idea of what accessibility is not is just as important, if not more so, than what accessibility is. And I think in terms of what accessibility is not text-only pages. Right? This is something I've seen a lot. I've seen people say, well, if we want to make something that is accessible, we can just make a text-only page and that's going to be accessible by default. And that's true. Right? That is technically true, but that's not what you do for anybody else. Right? It's kind of a cop-out. Right? It's almost like you've kind of given up at that point. If you're saying, well, if we have to make the site accessible, we're just going to put text on the page and not do anything with it, not make it look good. Right? Because then you're going the opposite direction. Right? In terms of your inclusion, in terms of your universality of design. And you're saying, well, people that are interacting with our site regularly, well, we don't need to worry about them. Right? So we don't want to go too far one way or too far another when we can actually go both directions simultaneously, right? Like it's not just, it's not a choice we have to make. Accessibility is also not a separate accessible version. This also used to be incredibly common. Right, and there was actually a lot of lawsuits that were brought about that made this change happen, where we started saying, no, we have to do more than just making a separate accessible version. Who would have thought that the idea of having separate but equal might not work. That's weird. Not to equate those two, by the way, but you kind of get what I mean there. I think this idea that trying to make two equitable things by having separate facilities and separate items, you're not going to make an equitable experience that way. And really what we're trying to do with accessibility is we are trying to have as much of an equitable experience as we possibly can. One of the things that we say in accessibility is basically, we kind of call it the 3 a.m. rule. Right? Like if a regularly abled, if an averagely abled person can do it from their home in their underpants at 3 a.m., then, someone with disability should be able to do that as well. Accessibility does not have to be boring, right? Like, we oftentimes think that we just have to simplify something down to being bare bones, but, all we really have to do is just kind of make sure that we're following a certain set of standards in order to meet some things. So we can have a really elaborate, really fancy looking website that, as long as we're mindful of what we're doing as we're writing our code, ensuring that we're doing things like, not just representing things with color, ensuring that we're doing things like utilizing semantic tags instead of divs, ensuring that we're doing things like using ARIA code when we need to, right? Thanks to semantic tags, we don't have to use ARIA quite as much as we once did, which is super beneficial, right? Because ARIA can be kind of confusing from time to time. Just using descriptive text and putting things out there, right? Like we can have fancy, pretty sites that are also super accessible. They're out there. They exist. And we can work with it. We can make something. It's also not difficult, right? Like we've kind of mentioned there. With semantic tags, we don't even have to worry about ARIA as much anymore. We can work with semantic tags. We can just make sure that we are following a certain set of rules. We have some standards that have been provided to us via WCAG that we can follow that are really, really great. And if we can just make these, we can just follow these standards and include them as a part of our design process, then just a little bit of mindfulness and we can, be making accessible websites and have that as a part of our, part of what we do, right? It's really, really not as bad as it looks. This is where I talk about the, assistive technology use being, glasses being our most being the most common thing that are gonna be, our highest level of assistive technology, or our most common assistive technology that's being utilized there. Let's see, where are we at? So let's talk about the idea of an edge case here. Just what exactly is an edge case? And when we think about an edge case, edge cases come up in design from time to time. We have the idea of outliers or edge cases. And it's kind of easy for us to kind of think that certain things don't really matter because they make up such a small segment of our base. And in Silicon Valley, oftentimes they call those edge cases. Or you might hear things like that referred to as outliers in statistics, right? If you look at it from a statistics perspective. But for our purpose, there are no edge cases, right? So when I think about it, I think about it this way, right? And like Facebook in particular claims to have 2 billion users. I made this presentation a couple years ago, so it's probably gone up since then, right? It's probably more like 3 or even 4 billion users right now, which only makes this number even higher. Right? So Facebook claims to have 2 billion users. And when we think about 2 billion users, and when somebody tells you, well, 1%, 1% of whatever. Well, 1% seems like a very small number, right? 1% is very tiny, right? But 1% of 2 billion, that's 20 million. So if Facebook did something where they created a design and it said, well, this design would alienate 1% of our users, that means that it would alienate 20% that names the 1% of 2 billion users is 20 million people. That's more people than the entire country of Hungary and the entire country of Honduras combined. Right? That's more people than the entire country's populations of Honduras and Hungary combined. That Facebook would just be leaving out. If they said, okay, yeah, we're okay with a feature alienating 1% of our population. Right, that is wild. Right, so when we think about edge cases from that perspective, right, there are no such thing as edge cases. 1% of a user base is so many people. It's so many people. So what can we do, right? There's just a certain handful of things that we can do here, right? We use descriptive alt text for images. We use good contrast for all elements. We can use a larger font size. We can represent all written content in plain text. Right? These are not new things that I'm telling you here. These are all, just regular items, regular things that you've heard me talk about before at this point. Right? Using semantic HTML5, using ARIA markup where necessary. Most importantly, just being mindful. Just being mindful. Is going to make a big difference here. And I can go into examples of all of these, but I don't really know that I have to. Right? Because we've done them over and over and over and over and over again. So what I'd like to leave you all with, I'd like to just go ahead and end this live stream just a little bit early this week and just leave you all with this thought. And it's, as you are going onto websites throughout this week, I'd like you to think about, well, what is accessible and what isn't? Right? What makes something accessible on this website that I'm currently on versus what would make this inaccessible? If I were to make this more accessible, what could I improve? And most importantly, I think, what is my reason for making things accessible? Right? Because I think we can all have our own reasons for why we would want to make things accessible. Right? And I think they could be just ultra, we looked at that short list of reasons for making things accessible earlier, whether it's the law or whether it's just based out of a moral obligation or based out of religious ideology, or some people just want to make money. And the idea of, hey, if I have an accessible website, then I can make more money because more people can buy my things. And so, I don't know that I'm necessarily opposed to an immoral or amoral reason for, doing a good thing, as it were. So those are the things that I'd like for you to look at. I'd like for you to look, as you're on websites this week, I'd like for you all to look at and try to take notes of things that are accessible, or maybe things that aren't accessible that should be accessible. And I'd like for you to come up with your own reason. I'd like for you to say, well, what is my reason for making sure things are accessible? Why am I going to ensure accessibility on all of my sites? Why is it going to be important to me? And that is where I will leave you for today. So as always, I want to thank you for watching. We'll hang out in the chat for just a minute, just in case anybody has any questions. Who's here with me watching live? If you are watching the recording and you have a question, please feel free to send me a Teams message or an email. But again, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.